There are a lot of choices when it comes to car shopping. Only Kelley Blue Book is your trusted resource for one-stop car shopping. Have confidence to price it, buy it, fix it, trade it, sell it, and love it when you KBB.com it. It's as easy to say as it is to use. Kelley Blue Book is the #1 most trusted third-party automotive site. So no matter what your it is, be empowered to nail it at KBB.com.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Cult Vault. Before we get started, I'd like to say a massive welcome to Caroline B, who is the newest patron. Thank you so much for choosing my tiny show to support, and I hope you're enjoying the back catalogue of exclusive content. I'm so grateful to each listener and patron for their continued support of the show. This week we're going back to a topic that's been covered quite extensively on the show, and that is the subject of the Jehovah's Witnesses. However, this time we have an amazing author as the guest. His name is Geoffrey Wallis. He's going to talk us through religious trauma syndrome, high demand religious groups, and being PIMO, physically in but mentally out. Here is Geoffrey. So hi Geoffrey, and thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast. I have covered the Jehovah's Witnesses quite extensively on the show, but after receiving and reading your memoir, A Voice from Inside, I felt it would be quite poignant to gain your perspective on the JWs, because you have the physically in, mentally out story that I want to share with the listeners, especially because so many of the community have come forward and expressed that that is the space that they are in. So I know that this is your pen name and you're working under a pseudonym, but would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, so my name's Geoffrey Wallis. I'm author of A Voice from Inside, Notes on Religious Trauma in a Captive Organization. I am physically in, mentally out, Jehovah's Witness at this point.
And at what point in your life did you join the movement?
Since I was very young. So we use the expression raised in the truth. That's a Jehovah's Witness expression. It means that a child of Jehovah's Witness parents and, raised from a young age with all of the materials and all of the books and all of the teachings and sitting in the meetings multiple times a week. It really is a cultural vacuum that you're part of from a very young age, which is different to the experience of individuals who come in as adults. Who maybe experience it a little bit different. It might be a phase in their life, whereas individuals who come up as children in the organization very much feel that that is the world, that one perspective of the world is the only one.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that is put down to the amount of time that is focused on sort of church involvement and activities from yourself and sort of the family unit as a whole?
Yeah. So it's a time commitment. It's called a high demand religious group for a reason, because multiple meetings a week, in addition to formalized preaching work. But in addition to that, the family values that are taught are connected with the church too. Mm-hmm. So a child will be taught by a mother and father who are held to supporting the doctrine of the organization. So they will use doctrinal information and Watchtower publications to train their children, and usually uphold the party line when it comes to raising their kids. So even within the home, there's an extension of that. It's not just what's happening at the Kingdom Hall, but it is what's happening, in the home. And, a lot of times with parents, they are concerned with raising children who are respectful and have good morals and values. That's an understandable parental concern. And so because of the material that's provided for children to help parents raise their children in an uncertain world, in the face of pluralism, they sort of are attracted, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see the appeal myself when there's so much doubt and guilt that comes with parenting. You feel like you're never quite doing enough for your children, and you're always wondering if you're doing things the correct way, and second guessing yourself and asking other parents for advice, and or receiving unwanted advice from other parents. And it's very difficult and stressful, and it's always something that's at the forefront of your mind. So if somebody comes to you with all the material on how it, one way that it could be done, one way that it should be done, and sort of lays it all out for you and says, here's all the tools you need to do it, air quotes, properly, I can see why some parents would say, fantastic, thank you so much, I was wondering how I was going to do it, and now I know. So that absolutely, I can see the appeal behind that. But would you say that you had what could be described as an average upbringing for somebody raised in the truth?
Yeah, I would say. And, a lot of times when you're looking back at your upbringing and you think, well, was there anything particularly strange or odd about it? And the thing with closed groups is that when you're in the group sort of bubble, there is nothing odd about the way you live, or there's nothing that feels very odd about the way you live. That's just your culture. But it's only when that rubs up against external information sources, other cultures, that you really run into, where you realize that, wow, we're really separate from mainstream society, and we hold some fundamental beliefs, perhaps even extreme beliefs, that others don't hold. So yeah, there's, it can be a very normal childhood until one sort of awakens to that difference there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one part of your book that I found really interesting when I was reading it was the sort of the way that baptism works in the church, and how at such a young age, kind of young adults can be offered this baptism before you would be able to sort of vote or make those big lifetime decisions, and yet you can commit to kind of giving your life to the church when you're maybe not quite old enough to realize the commitment that you're actually making at that age. And that was part of the book that I found, well, one of the parts. The whole book itself is really interesting, which I'll talk about a bit later, but that was one of the parts that specifically stuck out for me. And I know that we're not going to be too specific with your story, because obviously you're still active in the church, but can you give us a rough idea of when your baptism took place?
Yeah. So pre-teen years, I was baptized, and you're very right there. It's a commitment, not unlike the commitment of other mainstream churches, in terms of the spiritual implications, dedicating yourself to God, committing to a life of service to God. Those are the sort of spiritual implications. But the approach I take in the book are the organizational implications of that move, because this baptism is associated with the organization. It is the entrance into the high demand group itself. So at baptism, your name is on the roster. You are part of the group, and you are subject to its disciplinary policies. And for a young person that perhaps was raised in the organization, when they make that decision, now they're subject to that contract in perpetuity in terms of the social repercussions for exiting. And when seen from that perspective, you really can start to recognize how it's not an appropriate decision for a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old.
Absolutely.
Just recently, I saw a 7-year-old who was baptized.
Oh my goodness.
Of course, those in oversight, there's some formal questioning that goes on. So they have to be tested on doctrine and see if they agree with the policies. And the elders, or those in oversight, are very eager to have a new member of the fold. But really, there's nobody there sort of just to have that objective stance to say, is this something that a 7-year-old can decide? Because it's going to affect the rest of their life, particularly when thought reform and things like that are involved.
Yeah. I mean, 7, so even sort of 12 to 15, it's I remember thinking at that age that I knew everything, and now thinking back to my kind of preteen self, I'm thinking I didn't know anything at all. I don't think I even do now, but I'm sure I'll reflect in another 20 years and think, what was I doing at that age? But one thing I found interesting about another person I interviewed about their baptism was they explained how the church and all the congregants and everybody was kind of always building up the baptism and what it's kind of what you should be striving for, and it's an honor to have this experience, and it's kind of in my mind the way it was described, and some elements of your book came through sort of like this as well, is that you strive to have this baptism, and then once that's happened, you strive to reach this spiritual fulfillment that you can never actually really get to. So you're always trying to reach some part of life that you're just never going to get to. And he'd had he'd had an experience with another person sexually, which he had gone to the elders and spoke to about. And a few months later, he was supposed to have his baptism, and they wouldn't allow him to go ahead with it because of this sin that had happened, and he was absolutely crushed, and went on to do all this repenting and kind of trying to realign his spiritual beliefs, even though he wasn't fully convinced of those beliefs. He thought, if I can have this baptism, if I can get to that stage, if I can go through with this experience and go through with this event, then I'll get to that spiritual fulfillment that I'm being promised, and then I won't have these urges to do these things with people. Eventually he had his baptism and nothing changed. So I don't know if that speaks for itself. But,
yeah, it does. I mean, it's a bit of a sort of carrot and string situation. It's not unlike other social structures, for example, whether it's the corporate world or academia. We're always looking for this next step that's going to bring some new fulfillment. And then, of course, we get to that step and we realize, well, it did bring some fulfillment, but it also wasn't the answer to all of our worries and questions in our future. So the carrot that's dangled for up and coming Jehovah's Witnesses is this closeness with God, being close to Jehovah. So it becomes this spiritual greed almost, that I want to get closer to God. If I have this next rank in the organization, if I become a full-time preacher, they're called pioneers. If I become a pioneer, I'm going to be more holy, more spiritual. And although they won't admit it overtly, there is this sort of classism in terms of who is more spiritual in the organization based on the privileges of service within the group that individuals are given. So yeah, it can be a real ambition. And for many who go on to other privileges, and they call them privileges of service, other responsibilities in the organization, they will definitely be subject to their ambition to really try to get these, to really work hard, to change their conduct, to change their thinking, so that they can qualify in God's eyes to be given some sort of role in the organization. They pray about it. This was definitely my experience, praying about these opportunities in the organization that would come my way. And if I was holy enough, then God would bless me with them.
And it's hard for me to kind of wrap my head around when it's explained to me that way, because this same person that I interviewed was told he wasn't allowed to pioneer because he wasn't holy enough. And in my mind, it's like you're being punished by not being allowed to give up your free time and go and do all the and have these for some people difficult interactions with people outside of the church that you're trying to bring into the fold. You're not allowed to go out and give up your free time and do those things because you're not holy enough. So to me, it's kind of from my perspective, it's like, oh, okay, then I'll just have this time to myself. But I can understand how that would be crushing for some people who want to give all of that time to to have that closeness to Jehovah, to prove themselves and their spirituality, to show, the elders of the church that this is their life, and they want to commit themselves this much to the church. And
what is unseen there is the psychological bias that exists in individuals who really reach out for this, is their desire for prestige and notoriety and the egoic self.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, to be in positions of authority, to be in positions of prominence in any group of people, it gives us social capital. And that's fairly common human desire in all sorts of groups of people. So if you just look at it as a social group of people and a hierarchy, which gives you more prominence and more authority, then it plays to those very common human dynamics, even if you take God out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can see that in everyday life with social situations, even in high school, when you have, the popular kids and then the kids that want to sit with the popular kids and all that stuff. I think you can see that in all different types of community groups and societies. So, but we've mentioned sort of wanting to move up to the next rank, and privileges of service. And one of those I'm wondering if you would consider is this special book that you're given when you become an elder that no one else is allowed to see. I mean, is that classed as a privilege of service?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I find it very sort of ironic, poking around on the internet, that it's fairly easy to get your hands on the latest copy of the Elder's Manual. But this is a book that married elders hide from their wives. You are given it as you enter the elder body, and if you are removed, it is taken away from you. I mean, this is a really sort of secretive text.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And elders don't share with the rank and file all the ins and outs of their decision making and all the information that is brought out in the elders book. And that could be very difficult, because that means that those who are subject to the laws and the rules of the group do not always have full access to what they are. I mean, they do have a certain amount of access for other publications, but in terms of how judicial committees are handled and the intricacies of that, some of it is of the privilege of elders only. So I do quote a lot of that in my book.
Mm-hmm,
also,
mm-hmm.
Obviously it's important for others to know where they can find that outside of the organizational channels.
Yeah. And something that I found interesting about what you've just said there about the manual and the judicial meetings and kind of people not having access to that information is, if you are one of these people who is proselytized to, and you decide to go to a kingdom hall and see if it's going to be for you, maybe becoming a Jehovah's Witness, and then there is some type of altercation, but you're not aware at that time what is expected of you entirely, but you're still expected to then go to potentially a judicial meeting or be disfellowshipped, but the elders aren't allowed to give you that information because you're not baptized, because you've just been brought in. But then because of those things, you don't know sort of what's expected of you and sort of the lay of the land. I'm not really good at articulating myself.
You did very well. You're talking about and what I refer to in the book for this group of people. They're called unbaptized publishers. So they are, as you say, individuals who, you knock on the door, they show some interest, they come to the Kingdom Hall, they get involved in first the culture and the society of the group. So Kingdom Hall of 100 people, arms wide open, come be part of us, we'll help you, and we'll give you the spiritual path. And the reason I bring up their situation in the book is to evidence that coercion begins even before someone's baptized. So an individual can be very excited about being embraced by Jehovah's Witnesses. They will begin preaching. And if they want to begin preaching, then they have to meet certain criteria. And so the elders will ask them a handful of questions to see if their quote unquote life is in harmony with Bible teachings. And then if they meet that threshold of conduct, then they can begin preaching with Jehovah's Witnesses. And at that point, they can be subject to public shaming for conduct that is not in line with the policies before they have really, been given full understanding of all the ins and outs of the do's and don'ts. And so now, even if they were a little bit hesitant, they're subject to this simultaneous shaming and acceptance, which creates this psychological tug, right? On one hand, I'm finally found a group of people who love me. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they keep reminding me that I'm sinning and that I'm worthless, and even could do that publicly and then ostracize me from this group that seems to love me and that I seem to be getting along with. So this psychological push and pull can, fall upon even somebody who is not yet baptized in the group.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say, and you've just so eloquently helped me to kind of voice exactly what I was trying to say. And you mentioned that there are parts of the Elders Manual that feature in your book, which kind of leads me nicely into my next question. I'm assuming you received one of these manuals because you did or do hold the position of elder at some point within the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes. Yeah. So for many years, I served as an elder. So a lot of experience there. And in the book, I talk about some of my experiences on judicial committees, doling out the punishment. And this is part of what makes it very difficult for individuals who have some authority in the group to step away, is reckoning with what they've done to, cause human suffering. And that was certainly the case with me. So I know what it's like to sit on these 3-hour-long meetings discussing the intricacies of people's sexual conduct to see if, for example, it meets the threshold of disfellowshipping, and then subsequently to disfellowship them, and then subsequently to wrap my arms around the remaining family members and remind them that they're doing a good thing by shunning their family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was definitely part of the book that stood out to me. One thing that is so different about your text that I've never come across in any of the memoirs I've written is how much academic material there is within the book to back up the things that you're saying, to the things that you're trying to get across in the book. So I feel like that makes the moments where you talk about your personal story even more kind of hard hitting, because there's so much of this kind of talking about different psychiatrists and psychologists, and then there'll be a small bit about your experience, and it's kind of like, whoa, when you apply it to yourself, and then it goes back to talking about sort of the more academic stuff. So for any of the listeners that kind of go off to read this book, which we'll talk about more as we go on, it's not an experience I've had reading a memoir, so that I think that's what made it so enjoyable for me, and so different from anything that I've read before. But do you think it was, I mean, I don't know if you can pinpoint this exactly, but do you think it was your time, kind of during your time as an elder, that you began to have what you described in your book as religious trauma syndrome?
Yeah, absolutely. It was during that time. Mm-hmm.
And do you think, well, I know it's hard to kind of, you're not going to be able to put it down. And for anyone that's read or is going to go and read Geoffrey's work, then you'll understand why. But there's not exactly one moment that you can put it down to kind of what started it. And I mean, there's really good examples of how it progressed. And the one moment that I really, really liked in the book was when you decided to go and do some internet research. And when you read an article by or a piece of writing by somebody who had previously left the church, and they were describing exactly how you were feeling in that moment.
Yeah.
And you slammed your laptop down like, oh no, I can't be reading this.
Yeah. Well, there's a very famous work in Jehovah's Witness circles called Crisis of Conscience. It was written by a governing body member who left in the 80s.
That's it. Yeah.
And, so when I was struggling with this concept of, what's going to be the best move for me, because now I'm seeing some things in the organization. I no longer think that it is all good. When you believe that God is behind it, then you think, oh yeah, everything we do is wonderful. But when your faith and belief sort of crumbles, then you're just looking at it pragmatically in terms of how much pain do we cause and how much good do we do. Mm-hmm. And when I take the bird's eye view, how does this stack up? And that was no longer a clear answer. Obviously there are those who love being in the organization, but I was causing pain to others. So that was a crisis of conscience. Now, what would I do? Would I leave and cause pain to my family, or would I remain? How could I remain? What would that look like for me? And so, yeah, I realized I was having a crisis of conscience, which is the name of this very famous book. And I tell in the book, I Googled that, and, it's the very first response is a book from a fellow Jehovah's Witness. And you think, this is just a little too serendipitous. But of course, you still try and push it away because you think that, this is at the heart of the satanic apostasy of God against God's people. And
the last thing that you want after being brought up in the truth for your entire life is to think of yourself as an apostate, and you're reading the work of somebody who is classed as one. Mm-hmm. And your experiences and thoughts and feelings are so kind of in sync with what that person is saying that you don't want to come to the conclusion that you are, that you could be the same. But I mean, when you were an elder and you were kind of going through this religious trauma syndrome, which you've kind of shortened to RTS in the book, how do you continue kind of, as you said, it kind of doling out judicial decisions or punishments? How do you kind of, in your mind, what is happening to you in those, during those processes when you're having this awakening and still having to fulfill your role within the church?
Well, I don't do it anymore. That's a line for me that I don't cross.
Yeah.
So I don't have those elder responsibilities that I did in the past. Which is a relief, really. But at the time, it was it was a big struggle. And I talk about it in the book. There was a time where I was using medication just to get by. So just using benzos just to sort of rid my mind of all worries so that I could keep moving ahead, because I still could not sort of come to terms with the fact that I wasn't going to be able to continue doing what I had done all my life. So it's not a very nice window, but there were of my life, not a very nice window of my life, but there were some times when I was just absolutely just going through the moments and doing my best to say, well, I'm having this surge of emotion. I'm having this surge of rational thought that seems to go against the logic of my upbringing, but surely I can't be right. Surely I'm not right. Because I know Jehovah God is behind this. So it's that lack of trust in self, lack of trust in your own intuition, in the data of your own experience that gets in the way, or certainly for me, got in the way of me making a hard and fast decision to exit.
And it's kind of interesting that we've talked about that cycle of trying to reach this level of spirituality and closeness to Jehovah through being as perfect as you can be and going through the baptism, and then kind of committing yourself to maybe full-time pioneering and trying to kind of reach those next stages within the movement and gain those privileges of service. But there's also the cycle that you talk about in your book, that is the cycle of guilt, almost, that you started to go through, where you felt guilty for having sort of thoughts about maybe not being as devoted spiritually to the church than you maybe should be, and then guilt for feeling guilty about not being as spiritual as you should be. And then it's kind of like a cycle that doesn't end. So not only are you trying to reach this level of spirituality, you're also battling with the guilt of not being able to fully commit yourself to reaching that spirituality. And then one of the quotes that really stuck out for me in the book says, "I am not exaggerating when I say the situation is a matter of life and death." So when people are starting to experience this religious trauma syndrome that you also said can happen in any religious group, how do you go about dealing with all of that that's going on at the same time?
Well, I say it's a matter of life and death because suicidal ideation needs to be taken seriously as a mental health reality, right? When somebody is so distraught over being summarily rejected from their community that they're want to kill themselves, and also they've been told that God is disappointed with them, so much disappointed that he would cast them out of his protected people and throw them into a world of uncertainty and fear, that certainly has the opportunity to put somebody in such a depressive state that they could contemplate suicide. And historically, of course, based on what we see in news reports and the media, that is an eventuality for some who are disfellowshipped. And unfortunately, just very recently for me, I became privy just through acquaintances of another instance when that happened. And the fact that shunning can cause, or the disfellowshipping process can cause suicidal ideation is alluded to in the Elders book itself, in that there's a comment that says, well, if the guilty party threatens suicide or speaks of suicide, well, hold off on the judicial proceeding and then approach it later and try and help them to regain their balance. Of course, there is no discussion of connecting them with mental health resources, connecting them with a professional, giving them the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline phone number, or better yet, reevaluating the process as an organization.
Yeah.
And my situation, very, very much was, at least in my mind at the time, when I could not see that middle path, it was a matter of life and death.
Yeah. And I think that comes across so well in your writing, and it's backed up with, all these different examples of how a person can get into that situation. And I guess that other people that have experienced something similar, that's where the physically and mentally out phenomenon comes from. People are trying to work out a balance of maybe disillusionment, but also not wanting to be disfellowshipped and be shunned from their family and friends. So I don't know if, obviously I've never experienced this myself, so I don't know if that's exactly where that's come from, but would you,
yeah, you're right.
Would you put that would you say that that's the middle ground that you have managed to find?
It is, and I don't sort of recommend it as a solution. I'm careful not to do that. People got to go, they got to go. People got to stay, they got to stay. The point is they need to be allowed to make that decision, because family is important for a lot of people, and social support is necessary for mental health. So the reason I highlight this in the book, and I take that road of the PIMO, Jehovah's Witnesses, because I think it really speaks to the captive nature of the group. The fact that somebody would, even if only temporarily or perhaps permanently, choose to remain in an organization that they might be intellectually or ethically opposed to, because they feel that they are in a disempowered position and that they will be shunned by their family in perpetuity, that it will mean a death-like disconnect with family, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, children, that they just decide, well, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to figure out some other way.
Yeah.
And it's important to give that perspective, and it's important for outsiders to see that perspective, because it speaks very much to the infriction upon religious rights of disillusioned Jehovah's Witnesses.
I think that's why this particular memoir is so important and should be picked up by anybody in general, but also specifically for people who are trying to make that decision on whether it's best to stay or best to leave. And your book comes in and says straight away, like, I'm not trying to label the Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult. I'm trying to remain unbiased. I'm trying to kind of just come here and give all the information I can give without putting too much of a personal opinion on what's right, what's wrong, but why somebody might be PIMO and why it might be the only option for them. And your writing has extensive references to academic research, papers, books. There's references and comments from psychologists and philosophers, and just so much academic material. And I wondered if you began this journey into learning about this academia during or after your experience with religious trauma syndrome.
It was after, really part of the recovery, because this is, a few years removed from me now. It's not, this is something, healing my depressive ideation, my suicidal ideation, and the negative mental health state that I was in. That happened first. And I did that with professional psychotherapy and psychiatry. And then moving past that, then part of my journey was to, write about my experience for my own benefit, and then perhaps for the benefit of others too. So most of this research was done sort of, sporadically. Thumbnailed on your internet browser in a bookmarks tab, as you start realizing, wow, religious trauma syndrome, it sounds exactly, Marlene Winnell's work on religious trauma, it just sounds exactly like what I experienced. And this, I'm sure I'm not the first person who's experienced this as a Jehovah's Witness, and we need to know about this. And then seeing a little bit of a gap in the research, particularly about Jehovah's Witnesses. And I read George Cressidi's work, Continuity and Change. It's a 2016 textbook, really, likely with the target audience of sociology students or students of new religious movements. And he was really soft. It's a great work, excellent publication, but there was this gap, and it was my experience. It was what I was going through. It was the trauma of being in a closed group, awakening and recognizing that it wasn't just your faith. It was your entire social structure. It was your entire identity, because of the nature of the organization itself, and because of the nature of the religion and the closed nature of it. And it's something that needed to be added with an academic focus, I think, just in terms of understanding cult-like groups.
And I think that's exactly what the book accomplishes. And that's why I think it is so interesting and such an important text, is because it does exactly what you've just said. It describes the PIMO phenomenon and how somebody might arrive in that situation themselves. But it talks so much about coercion and how the religion uses coercion and why that creates such a difficult situation for the people involved, and how it's not like you can just join, like air quotes, join a cult and then leave a cult, because that's not what happens in any of these situations, in any of these high demand religious groups. It's not something you can walk into and then walk out of. And we've already had a short discussion about people who have been love bombed when they've walked through the doors of the Kingdom Hall and thought, oh, maybe I finally found my group. And then all of a sudden are being subjected to public shaming, and having that kind of tug of war between sort of, I really want to stay, but maybe I shouldn't because these awful things are happening to me. So that, I think that's summarized the book the way I perceived it anyway. And there were just lots of parts of it. And I really appreciated, actually, when I was reading it, how you were able to summarize thoughts that I'd had, but wasn't able to articulate in my own mind, about the way these groups work in terms of, I think I wrote some quotes down. So yeah, I made one quote here, or wrote down one quote here that says, "These religions do not allow for the spectrum of gender and sexual expression that we see in modern culture." And I talk in almost every episode about the LGBTQIA plus community. And I always ask the people I'm interviewing, you know, what is your group like around this community group? Is there any level of acceptance? Is there any kind of potential for some kind of acceptance in the future? And I keep saying these groups are so archaic, and I don't see how they are recruiting new members when the world seems so progressive, but these religions stay still and they don't move forward. And so a couple of the quotes that I've written down are thoughts that I've had but not managed to articulate, and you've done it perfectly. Another quote you said was, "Christian groups have undergone the difficult task of maintaining their faith while readjusting to trends in tolerance." And I really appreciated that comment, but also then thought to myself, not all Christian groups have done that, because so many I speak to kind of still have this really hostile view on the LGBT community, and, you know, parts of the doctrine that are taken seriously, like no sex before marriage, and all of those things as well.
And it's definitely it's a big problem, you know, and I speak at length about the stigma I draw from Janja Lalich's work. She wrote a paper in 2010 about, and she's, you know, the cult expert right now. She's my little academic crush. One day I'll get to talk to her. Hopefully she's listening. But you know, her work, it was just incredible how she spoke about that stigma that somebody would feel who, you know, I love my God, but my sexuality is so tied to who I am as an individual. And I'm also afraid of leaving this group, and the amount of conflict that would bring on somebody. So I speak about that a little bit. And then we also have to understand that now, as progressive communities sort of grow in their empathy, and people have, you know, the biological and psychological sciences improve, well, we start to realize things like homosexuality and gender non-binaryism is like a, you know, demonstrable part of the human existence now. As individuals get exposed to that information, it will challenge their beliefs. It does create cognitive dissonance, and in that, Jehovah's Witnesses all the way up the ranks are motivated by empathy and fellow feeling, and have those same parts of their brain that work like anybody else's do to show kindness. Now they're going to have some real conflict because their enshrined doctrine, the one from their God, seems to go against the one that operates, that the humanist law that seems to operate in their very bones. And so religious groups have a hard time with Western Christian, you know, Abrahamic based cultures, because anthropologically and culturally speaking, we are drawn, you know, Western cultures, we're drawn from those Abrahamic cultures. And now as religion sorts, you know, becomes less rigid and less powerful, people move on to different values, but they still lurk in the undercurrent of a lot of our infrastructures. And so it is difficult for groups to address that. Will Jehovah's Witnesses ever do that? I don't know. See, the other option that a group has when they run up against this dissonance with humanist values is something that philosopher Robert Kane calls the retraction into fundamentalism. So while some groups will grow and there'll be this awkward growth phase where they're like, okay, well, let's twist and turn the doctrine now to make it work, to show more tolerance.
Yeah.
Others will avoid the work and they will retract into fundamentalism, which means that they will put up a more fierce wall. They will use even more manipulation. They will use even stronger emotion-laden propaganda to draw the line even firmer. That's where we run into problems.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example there you've just given us of the types of information that can be found in your book that sum up things that we've been discussing on this podcast for well over a year. How I could read the Bible and interpret it my way today and then say that's the only way, that's the right way, and everybody should listen to the way that I'm trying to tell you because that's what's correct. And I've always wondered what that process kind of looks like academically, and you've just told me there. So
well, it's a process of deconstruction that a lot of, in the United States, evangelical Christianity in the United States, a lot of these groups are kind of going through this process of deconversion. Okay, so like reevaluating traditional Christian beliefs in the light of technology and progress. And it's work to be done, and people fall. And once that work is done, they fall on all sorts of places on the spectrum of religious belief.
And do you think that there are more high demand religious groups out there that will have these physically and mentally out members kind of within their folds? Yeah,
definitely. There are obvious cult-like groups like the ones that you've talked about on your podcast. And whenever there is this threat of rejection, and whenever there is the threat of being sort of demoted as a person. Robert Lifton, in the book that I quote, his comments on thought reform, talk about the dispersing of or suspension of existence, which means that you will be rejected as a person. You are no longer a person. You are no longer a good person or a righteous person or a holy person or a godlike person. When that is what is to be lost by exiting a group, and there is no internal confidence that I am actually an okay person, or I can be an okay person moving forward, because the fear responses have been like neurologically programmed since I was a child. Now that is where individuals really will get this rub, and they will feel the authority of the organization. And regardless of where anybody ends up on the spectrum of belief, there's a power structure involved. And this is where the real restriction of rights comes in, and the usurpation of power in the organization, because even if somebody is sort of exiting or doing less, the elders of the congregation still represent the authority that has the power to remove you from your family. So rightly or wrongly, whether or not you believe, they always will represent that power in your life, as long as and as long as these captive policies remain.
Yeah. And what you said there about sort of not believing that you're an okay person if you are no longer a member of your church, if you're cast out and you're no longer sort of a holy person or godly person, and you're left to the basically like the evils, the devil, you've got no more protection. So all the sinful things in the world that you're told to stay away from, that you're basically taught to be petrified of your entire life, you're just going to be subjected to all those things now, because you don't have the protection of your spirituality, basically. And you're also going to be one of those people who's not okay, because they're not a member of the church and they're not a member of the movement, and they're influenced by all of the negative forces, the like us ungodly people like myself. They're the people that are going to be waiting for you. These people that you've been warned about your entire life, and how these people will be bad influences, and they will try and get you involved in things that will take you further away from God. And those are the people that you're going to be lumped with now, because you're not allowed to be with us anymore. So that must play a huge part in it as well, when people are trying to make their decision on where to go with their level of commitment. Yeah,
prejudice is, as much as we like to sort of demonize it, it's a biological reality or it appears to be a psychological and a neuropsychological reality of the human experience, that we have neurotransmitters that fire and make us feel good when we're with our own people, and also when we are criticizing outsiders. It feels good. It makes us feel like a sense of camaraderie. And so this is just common to the human experience. But what that means is that outsiders are very much a different sort of person. They are viewed in the Jehovah's Witness lingo as worldly. In fact, even in the 1950s, outsiders were called worldlings, like they were aliens or something. Sort of, as if they are completely different to you. So you don't know how perhaps you may feel uncomfortable interacting. There's also this sort of triple faceted stigma that I talk about in the book, where you were always afraid of outsiders and you felt different from them. And now you're afraid of insiders because they can out you as a non-believer. And then also you have this internal struggle with whether or not you've made the right decision, whether or not you are in fact right with God, if you still believe in God. And so it can be very lonely, and it makes you feel like there's nowhere to go. That's when those feelings of being trapped come, and hopelessness. And hopelessness is directly linked with suicidality.
It's awful to think of people in those situations, because where can you go? I mean, you mentioned the word trapped there, and I think that's exactly you must feel like you're in a confined space, even though you can freely move around. You can't, you're having this battle with yourself, but then you can't speak to anybody about it, because they might go and tell the elders, and then there's the whole potential judicial committee that you'll be faced with. But also, is there sort of the journey then of, if you do voice those thoughts, you're admitting to yourself as well that you perhaps aren't as invested in your beliefs as you think you should be? It's hard. You just said there it's a triple thing, so it's kind of like it doesn't matter what you do or how you look at it, you're gonna come up to all these struggles that you'll be having psychologically.
But you're right. Yeah, speaking a doubt, but there's a difference between speaking a doubt, or we could even say an emotional vulnerability, in a place of safety, and speaking an emotional vulnerability in a place where you're threatened. So if you're disempowered and you express an emotional vulnerability, the individual in sort of authority or power now can respond in a way that can be really damaging. And so this is where you get concepts like gaslighting, where, I see it this way. Something that I believe doesn't seem to line up with logic, you think to yourself. If you express that to somebody who has authority over you, power over you, or the ability to take something from you, now you're threatened with self-doubt. So because of the fear response, you think, well, it's too scary, or the ramifications for having that thought will be too much. So I will repress that thought. And so that's sort of the emotional experience of gaslighting. Like, I thought I had this thought, but then I was told that I was not thinking correctly. And then I'm self-doubting. Now it's a terrible state to be in. The difference is when you are in a place of safety and authenticity, and you express a doubt, then somebody who is not interested in controlling you, and somebody who, where the power dynamic is on a level playing field, now can just acknowledge your doubt. Oh, yeah, okay, I could see that too. That makes sense. I understand what you're getting at there. And you feel heard, and you feel safe for expressing that thought. But when everybody in your social circle and all of your mentors and all of your friends and all of your family, when their first loyalty is to the organization, they always have that power over you. There's always that threat of self-reporting or of reporting to the elders, that sort of self-policing atmosphere that happens in Jehovah's Witnesses, until the individual can feel like, wow, I can express these doubts without fear of judicial repercussion. Well, now that gives breath to the new thought, which can then grow in the mind and then can expand to other types of thinking and eventually expand to a genuine behavioral response, which could be leaving or expressing a new belief or empowering oneself to move away from a coercive group.
So it's almost like that process has to happen for somebody to be able to realize that perhaps being physically in and mentally in isn't for them personally. And just going back to something you mentioned a little bit before around creating that sort of us versus them atmosphere, where we were talking about worldly people. There was a part in your book that stood out to me about even terms like Kingdom Hall and being brought up in the truth kind of imply to members that is the correct and only way. And all of us on the outside who could never, or who haven't experienced something as wonderful as a Kingdom Hall, which sounds so extravagant and amazing, and I want to go to a Kingdom Hall. If somebody would have said that to me before I knew anything about Jehovah's Witnesses, I'd be like, wow, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of being brought up in the truth then insinuates that anybody that's not a Jehovah's Witness just doesn't know the truth and hasn't experienced that.
Yeah. There's like a spiritual elitism. There's a bit of an arrogance there, that you are the one true group. And in the book, I talk about how that was reinforced back in the 1920s by Rutherford's rhetoric, and how he was eager to separate Jehovah's Witnesses from mainstream Christianity. At least this is sociologist James Beckford's opinion from a book he wrote about Jehovah's Witnesses in 1975 called The Trumpet of Prophecy, was that he was differentiating the organization, which is what everybody does in successful businesses or economic pursuits, right? You set yourself apart from your competitor and lean into your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. And so what he did was he started saying, no, we don't go to churches, we go to Kingdom Halls. Now we're going to say that there's a line in the sand between false religion and true religion. We're going to be called not just Bible students, because, kind of anybody could be a Bible student. We're going to be called Jehovah's Witnesses, and we're going to use that name as an identifier. So yeah, it creates this line in the sand where you think you have the truth. There is a scripture that's commonly quoted, Isaiah 43, about where God says, "You are my witnesses," is the utterance of Jehovah. So, and in other translations, it's expressed differently. But in the mind of a Jehovah's Witness, when God says, "You are my witnesses," is the utterance of Jehovah. Well, see, we are Jehovah's Witnesses, and we are the ones with that name. We use the quote unquote, correct pronunciation of God's name. And because we're so confident we have the truth, we're going to go out and tell others. And that movement from the understanding that you have sole ownership of truth into the ambiguities of life is a really difficult process.
And feeds into that self-doubt that we then moved on to talking about, when you have a thought that you maybe share with somebody else, and then the gaslighting, it kind of is used, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, so maybe that small thought I had, I was wrong, or I must have misinterpreted my own thought for something that is not me thinking that some of this doctrine can't be right. And then sometimes the words of encouragement are to go and pray more. You must not be praying enough. So go and pray more, and your kind of relationship with Jehovah will grow stronger, and you'll be spiritually healed because you'll be doing all this praying. And I feel like that is another tactic that is used for you to not have space to grow these thoughts when you're having this doubt, like you mentioned, when these thoughts can kind of bloom into something a bit more tangible. Would you say that is the case for people who are just told to, don't worry, just go and pray some more?
Yeah, it becomes, absence of any religious significance. What is prayer? Well, it's sort of like a meditation, or it's a way of being one with your thoughts. But for the Jehovah's Witness, it can be a religious compulsion, to where if you have an errant thought, either an unsanctioned desire or some sort of intellectual thought that is dangerous, then you go back to prayer and you reinforce your faith, and you reinforce and you pray to God, don't let me have that thought, don't let me have that thought, don't let me have that thought. And then of course you have a thought, and we're starting to, you're in this battle of understanding the simultaneous power and powerlessness of a thought. So thoughts can be extremely powerful when they are unwanted and you don't know where to put them, and they're alighting on some sort of psychological weakness or insecurity. We all have that experience where thoughts are troublesome, but in reality, they are just thoughts. They have no impact on the real world. They don't even need to have any impact on behavioral outcomes. They simply are things that arise in consciousness. And so I found a lot of help with meditation, recognizing that thoughts are really just things that arise in our consciousness and don't need to have any power over us. But that's not what is taught to Jehovah's Witnesses. A couple scriptures come to mind where Jehovah's Witnesses are asked to bring every thought into captivity into the Christ. So it's this idea that you should be able to bring your thoughts into a certain pattern of thinking if you are holy enough, if you are close enough to God. And when you have this thought that does not come back into the framework that it's supposed to, well, you better go pray again. Another one I can think of is where Jesus says, anybody who is even looking at a woman is having adultery with her in his heart. Well, this is a cognitive fallacy, right? This is a cognitive distortion, that a thought is the same as an action, because it is not. And so that's where thought reform gets really painful, because it doesn't allow even just a spurious work of the imagination or abstract cognition that just comes out of nowhere, and the Jehovah's Witness will feel guilty for that and then return to compulsive religious activity to try and bring that thought back in. Prayer, Bible reading, go out and service more, et cetera, et cetera.
Which is exactly what we've spoken about, and what you mentioned sort of in your book around your process with RTS, when you were caught in this cycle of having these thoughts and then feeling guilty for having those thoughts, and then going back to the scripture, and then realizing that maybe the scripture wasn't doing what it should be, and then feeling guilty about that, and then kind of caught in this awful psychological cycle of just trying to muddle your way through realizing that you just didn't believe anymore, or ever did. I mean, I don't know, and I can't speak for people who are kind of experiencing this PIMO life themselves, whether they ever fully believed or kind of just gradually realized that the scripture isn't true. I'm not sure. But
it may be that they always had doubts and held them close to the chest, just like, I don't really, one I remember from my youth, it had to do with the natural sciences, that animals did not evolve with teeth for tearing flesh. They were created with pointy teeth, but really those teeth are supposed to be used for vegetables. It was very difficult to get my head around that, just based on information from the natural sciences. But I just kept it to myself, moved on, thinking that, I'm still operating for the greater good. I'm still helping people. I'm still bringing them into a loving organization, helping them deal with the challenges of life and giving them hope. And that's very much enough for many to push some of these other doctrinal idiosyncrasies away. And for me, the problem, and I think for a lot of PIMOs, the problem becomes when they realize the side effects of this wonderful spiritual haven that's been created. Well, it has come with extremely painful, life-threatening side effects for those who do not remain. And that's where no longer is the goodness, any supposed goodness of the group, able to overpower the doubts and the badness that's happening.
And that was perfectly explained to me by somebody who is an ex-Jehovah's Witness who I interviewed for the show, who spoke about being attracted to other men, but knowing that he couldn't act on those attractions, and praying more and getting baptized and wondering why those thoughts and feelings didn't go away, and feeling like a failure in his religion because he was doing all the things he thought was expected of him spiritually and still having these thoughts and feelings towards the same sex, even though it's taught to him his entire life that that's going against God, against Jehovah. And then deciding that he would just have to marry a woman and have children with her and stay as a Jehovah's Witness for the rest of his life, and push those thoughts and feelings so far down, and just basically live a life that's not authentic to how he really was feeling, like, forever. And I can't imagine having to make that decision. That must be absolutely awful. And there must be so many people that are actually living like that life and are not being true to themselves because of what they would lose if they decided to walk away and have a relationship with somebody of the same sex, or have a relationship with somebody and not marry them. People must be probably listening to this right now and having those experiences of being physically in and mentally out. And I just, it really is heartbreaking to think about those people that have just decided to never give themselves true happiness.
That's it. Never, and, it is heartbreaking because, and the problem is there's that self-pride that is taken to know that I'm fighting the fine fight of the faith, right? As scripture says. So, okay, yes, I have homosexual thoughts or desires, but you know what? God says it's wrong. I fight it day in and day out, and he loves me because of that.
Yeah.
That's why he loves me, is because I put up this hard fight to support the truth and support what he has asked me to do. And so that is such a strong motivator. It's such a strong motivator.
You've grown up with these family ideals that follow the church, then there's that whole other element of not wanting to almost not let your parents down or your family down, or not let people down because you're not what they think you should be. Which is a whole other element to this. Not only would you be potentially jeopardizing a relationship with family and friends altogether, like they've just completely vanished off the face of the earth, and you're never going to get the opportunity to see them and speak to them again. And not only that, but they're probably going to willingly accept that they're never going to speak to you again.
Yeah. Because
you've been disfellowshipped. You also don't want to go to them and say, like, I'm not I don't know. I don't even know what the word is, because for me it's like, I don't know. I don't see how somebody who is attracted to the same sex can't be spiritual. But it must be difficult. I mean, I know that the process around people coming out to family and friends is a massive deal, and is difficult for a lot of people because they are worried about how people will view them and the repercussions of having those conversations. But when you bring religion and spirituality that is against people within that community group, when you bring in that element as well, it just kind of, it changes it into something completely different.
Of course, it moralizes sexual behavior. This is a greater problem, right? Moralizing sexual behavior instead of just recognizing it as something that humans do, and not attaching sort of like the standards and unnecessary ethics to it. But it's this rejection by God. So it not only is it a permanent stance against one's family, but it's necessary to re-describe one's God. In terms of if there is a belief in God that remains, then it needs to be one that accepts you for who you are, and I think what happens with a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly those who are raised in the organization, is it leads to agnosticism or atheism, because every value and standard that they had was tied up with this God. And in order to live an authentic lifestyle that's genuine to them, they're constantly hitting up against this indoctrinated standard that their God has doled out on them. So it's always rubbing up against God. And so it ends up, and because the only God that you've ever had is Jehovah, who is sort of monopolized by the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's easy to toss out the God concept, or it may be necessary for some to do that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think for some of the people I've spoken to, that's the case, including this one person I mentioned who decided that he would take being disfellowshipped so that he could go on to have relationships with people of the same sex. And he's married now, and he's really happy. And I know that's not an option for everybody, and that's why we're having this discussion today. But he made that decision. It was incredibly difficult, and now he is living a life with other worldly people that he never thought possible at the time. So and what a relief, right? To release yourself of that burden.
Absolutely.
Of the omnipresent judgment of your sexuality.
Yeah. And he mentioned a moment where he was in the airport and he was returning home, and he knew he was going to have to go to his Kingdom Hall, and he'd been traveling on his own. He'd been to visit other Kingdom Halls and places he'd visited, and found that the people in the hostels and the dorms that he stayed in, that kind of weren't tied to the JWs, were more friendly than anybody he'd ever met in his whole life. He said there was no pressure to be modest or to pretend that you were more than you are. spiritually. And then he kind of had this feeling in the airport of being trapped because he knew what he was going back to, and went to the bathroom and just broke down in the stall because he realized that he was going to walk away at that point. Wow. And he knew what that would involve, but he had sort of this moment of just realization, and that was the first time that somebody had described to me in so much detail sort of exactly the moment when that happened for them and how it happened. So that was quite a moving discussion to have. Beautiful. But I've just got a few more questions to go through, and these are sort of more for people who are listening who may be in the PIMO situation, or getting themselves towards being in that situation. And that's to start by asking you if you can tell us what some initial symptoms of religious trauma syndrome might be.
Well, religious trauma syndrome is related to PTSD. So the symptoms of PTSD are anxiety, depression, panic attacks, suicidal ideation, intrusive thoughts. That is common to PTSD experience. And it's a very extreme version of more common mental health challenges like depression and anxiety, which can lead up to that. So I'm not a mental health professional, so I would encourage individuals who are having depression and anxiety and then to seek medical attention, because that brings it out of this sort of squishy area of spirituality and the social dynamics of your environment, and it addresses it for what it is, which is a health concern. And there are professionals who probably don't care too much whether you're a witness or you're not, will respect your decision in that, whatever it is you choose to do, but will help you navigate to a place of health, which is what I want for everybody.
And you spoke about your own journey in getting to where you are now, and that did include going to have some professional assistance in recovering, and then you went on to kind of start doing some reading and research into some more academic material. So would you say that professional assistance and reading and research are some of the methods that people could use to help themselves with their RTS?
Yeah, in that it's a mental health symptoms, then professional help is the way to go. And for me, I found it very difficult speaking to outsider psychotherapists. I found it very triggering at first, because there was still the fear that, I had one hand on my old faith, one hand on my old God, one hand on my loved ones, and I was hanging on desperately. And outsiders still represented this threat that they would say, get out, leave all that behind. And that was a threat that I was not ready it was a challenge I was not ready to accept yet. So in the initial stages, when I was seeking outside help, it was very triggering. But I eventually connected with a religious trauma informed therapist. And that, I think, is really valuable as there's more understanding about religious trauma, how it's affecting other groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Mormons, ex-evangelicals, others from high control groups. Somebody that understands your experience is going to know the things that trigger you, help you to address your concerns, and really just empower you to make a decision that's your own. And that's very important here. Is unfortunately, this captive environment makes us feel like, this is a black and white situation. And in many cases it is. I think for me, I wasn't going to leave my family. And so that meant that I had to create a path now, because I knew that the only place of health for me was to, still be connected to my family, but to still have psychological liberty.
Yeah.
And then to explore that on the day-to-day and give myself some time to see where that leads.
Yep.
But you can do that in the safety of a therapist's office. And that's important. That's important. The problem that I see in the organization is the stigma surrounding mental health. It's one of my concerns as sort of like an observer in the group now, not caught up in the collective consciousness, but able to sort of observe a bit, is there is that spiritual fear of psychotherapy. It does present a threat to your faith in many people's minds still. So undoing that stigma will be important too.
So reading and research and therapy, if you have access to it, if it's something that's available to you, and more specifically, if you can find a therapist that has specialized or has experience in religious trauma, for anybody who may find themselves in a situation where they're struggling, not sure where to go next, not sure how to juggle sort of the guilt cycle that we've spoken about, and especially anybody that is struggling with depression, anxiety, any thoughts around suicidal, any thoughts around suicide and self-harm. There's also the XJW subreddit, which is a fantastic resource for people that want to speak to others who have had similar experiences, and use that as a discussion board and a forum to kind of get all of that out there. What I love about that subreddit is every day someone will put a picture up of their new tattoo, or their carved pumpkin, or their shoulders, or their clavicles, and say, "Look at me." And I find that so wholesome. That you know, somebody putting up their Christmas tree is to worldly people will seem like no big deal, but to people in that subreddit, it's quite a special thing. So there's a lot of love there in that subreddit.
That's great. And while you're speaking about mental health, in the United States, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and the Trevor Lifeline are both free 24-hour services. They're completely confidential, and they are always there. They're always willing to speak. So if somebody does find themselves in a captive atmosphere, feels disempowered, and needs some support, then have those numbers on speed dial.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I'll also make a note to put those numbers into the episode description, where I will also put a link to your website, wallacebooks.com. But before we finish, there was a few things I wanted to ask. You speak in your book about trying to maintain an almost neutral perspective, which includes not praising the Watchtower Society, and also includes not openly labeling the JWs as a cult, or the Watchtower Society as a cult. But I wonder if you've received any backlash despite efforts to remain neutral and anonymous.
So far, so good. It was a big fear of mine writing the book, because I felt like even in coming out and expressing my story, that I would again be sort of pressured into that inside outside. I no longer belong in my faith group, but I won't be accepted by outsiders because I haven't made the formal decision to leave.
Right.
But so far so good. And I know I'm on a cult podcast. But the reason for that is to attempt to cut through the dialogue a little bit. Expressions like new religious movement and high demand religious group are not so emotion laden. So if you've been in a high demand group or a closed community, the power of language to affect emotional outcomes. So that you can use a scripture or a phrase, and you can incite discomfort in the audience. We know that as Jehovah's Witnesses because we use those tactics in our preaching and in our rhetoric. So I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to sort of give ammunition and be dismissed just as another ex-member who turns and calls his previous group a cult.
Yeah.
And so that's the reason for that.
Yeah. And that actually, you can see that the examples of that language in, I interviewed a lady a few months ago called Amanda Montell, and she's just released her book called Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism. And it's such a perfect example of how language is used in these high demand groups. Even from, she talks about multi-level marketing and soul cycle and groups that aren't even religious, and how language is used to basically apply the same coercive thinking and tactics to people involved in those groups as well. So language is probably the most powerful tool when it comes to these groups. And actually, I did write down a quote from your book that said, "This book too will no doubt be labelled as a scheming work of a sinister apostate." So it's nice to hear that hasn't happened to you, and you haven't been put in a position where you've had to defend yourself or out yourself, or face disfellowshipping because of this work that you've released.
Well, I appreciate that. It's a little bit of denying the impact of that control in my life a little bit by removing the power from the group to forcibly disconnect me from the people that I love.
Yeah.
This is my way of doing that.
And there was an example of somebody that this almost happened to, and I wondered if you could tell the listeners who might not be familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses or things that have happened around the JWs, and that is to tell us who Dark Spilver is.
Yeah, so I talk about the case of Dark Spilver just as a reason for my anonymity too, because he, on a Reddit page, he uploaded a picture of, I think, the back of a Watchtower magazine and maybe a copy of what Jehovah's Witnesses called a publisher record card, which is information that's retained at the congregation level and also at the headquarters level on individual witnesses. So he posted some pictures, said some quote unquote defamatory things about the organization, and the organization's legal team took him to court for breach of copyright. So because he did not have, it was outside the bounds of acceptable use, took Reddit to court for copyright, and an effort was made to disclose his personal identity during the course of the trial. And the justice, so Dark Spilver argued, well, if I do expose my anonymity and give up my right to anonymous free speech on the internet, then I will be rejected from my community and I'll be subject to the organization's judicial proceedings. And so he said, I don't want to give up my anonymity. And the justice said, well, you're going to have to at least give your name to the prosecution team from Watchtower so that we can carry on. But we will not allow it to go beyond that, to be given to headquarters in general, the local congregation, etc. So while from a legal standpoint, I think his identity was uncovered, from an organizational standpoint, it was not. But that just speaks to my decision to, be a little cautious about my personal identity.
Absolutely. And I can completely appreciate why somebody would make that decision, especially when they're in your position of still remaining within the fold, but not really adhering to the way that you should, well, the way that the Watchtower would tell you to be.
It's a matter of criticality. Can one be in the group and be critical? And the answer is, well, no, you'll be kicked out, and that's really all that this young man, I assume, Dark Spilver, was doing was being critical, was speaking out. And as we know, the one way to moderate the abuse of power is to be critical and to speak out and to check the power. That happens in every group of humans, politics, etc. So that really is a fundamental human right of his that is violated.
What is interesting about that entire situation, though, is that there's obviously a team that is actively
monitoring?
Encouraged to go and read the stuff that you're all told you're not allowed to go and read. So
yeah, that's
where's
odd, huh?
Where's the line there? I mean,
I don't know how that works.
What if those people read something that is going to taint their perspective on their faith?
I think strange. And I don't know the case, but when one removes faith from the picture, then you operate with business principles and self-protection, and it is what it is at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are parts of your book where you talk about how PIMOs who have pioneered or made decisions for their children around sort of the blood doctrine, elders who are PIMOs that have sat in judicial meetings and have had to make a decision on what the consequences of somebody's judicial hearing might be. Do you have any advice for these people who may be tackling that mindset, but also still be involved in this heavy decision making that comes with the faith itself?
You mean those in roles of oversight?
Yeah.
That's hard to say. It really is. It's a difficult situation. The important part is to to create, I think, spaces where one can be authentic. That starts with self-honesty, but then it extends to really the making of true, real friends, which, although we had a lot of acquaintances as Jehovah's Witnesses and friends, one could say there's this automatic intimacy that happens because of a shared acceptance of a belief.
Right.
When that is gone, friendships become very one-on-one, and you sort of share vulnerable pieces of yourself slowly, and you develop a trusted relationship on a one-on-one basis with a friend. That's how friendships are made. But surprisingly enough, when you don't have the fail-safe of the religion, that takes a little bit more work than perhaps individuals who are raised as Jehovah's Witnesses are aware of, to create authentic relationships. But the point is, human authenticity, Carl Rogers talks about this on his theories of personality, is when you can be authentic with somebody and they are willing to be authentic with you and vulnerable with you, well, then incredible things can happen for congruence and psychological homeostasis, or what we would say, bringing you peace and giving you the strength you need to design a life that works for you. So that's what I would say. Find a place where you can speak safely, and where you are encouraged to be yourself, and where you're encouraged to think for yourself, and when you are not persuaded to think or behave in any way that doesn't work for you.
Yeah. That's great. That's great advice, I think, for anybody that may be listening and struggling with those, and not even for people that are in those higher up positions within the church, just people in general. That was great advice. That's just great life advice overall. That's great. I can't recommend your work enough. I've got so many quotes here that I've written down. I read it on my iPhone, and I don't know if you've ever used iBooks, but there's an option to highlight as you go through the book, and then cool. You can export the parts that you've highlighted into a PDF document. So I read the book and then I exported all of the quotes and parts of the book that I'd highlighted. And it was like I'd basically exported the entire book into a PDF document. I know I was supposed to use it as a tool to narrow down like specific parts that I wanted to talk about, but it ended up like so much of the book that I was like, oh, now I don't, it was, I just have to like, if I read through everything I highlighted to pick out the parts I wanted, I would have reread the book. So
oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I really, really did. And I really do recognize, I really do recommend people go and give it a read. If only like not just for the discussion around being physically and mentally out, and not even for the discussion around religious trauma syndrome, which both of those two subjects could have their own books respectively, but it's almost like a list of resources to go and educate yourself more on coercion, to go and educate yourself more on language, on history, on how the Watchtower Society was born and how it changed, and all these different professionals that have done all this research on religion and yeah, so it's almost like a list of resources as well that people can go and check out and read more into that you've referenced throughout the book. So also
check out I've been working with the folks at igotout.org.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
They're a group that basically is a platform for stories. So they encourage individuals to write their story as a way of processing it. And the one thing that's important, whether individuals go through sort of to the extent of PTSD trauma from leaving a group or religious dissolution, or if they experience disfellowshipping and shunning, it's something that needs to be processed and worked through, or it can just be one of those wounds that can have negative outcomes in our life if it's not really processed, either therapeutically or creatively, etc. So I Got Out just basically gives you a platform to tell your story. You can submit it to them and they publish it anonymously if you'd like. And they also have some good resources there and others to connect to.
Yeah, absolutely. We did have them on the show a few months back to chat with us about their work, and it was described as a hashtag movement. So you can find them actively on Instagram at hashtag #IGotOut, or you can go on igotout.org and you can read up about people submitting their stories there. And there's some fantastic stuff every day. And they also are very good at sharing other people's posts from people such as yourself, who will be talking about the work that they're doing or experiences that they've had. So that's a great recommendation. People definitely go and have a look at that. So I think, unless there's anything you wanted to add specifically, Geoffrey, I think we've gone through everything that I wanted to ask.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on the podcast. You know, your work, I'm sure is something that you're passionate about, but it is helpful, you know, because individuals, the more we learn about groups, we can draw connections, and we can just be aware of what goes on in closed groups and make decisions that are more informed. So it's important what you're doing.
I absolutely hope that is what these episodes bring to people, is the ability to kind of recognize potential red flags in various community groups and settings in society, and set people up with some tools to recognize when something might not be quite right, but also as a tool for people to listen to inspiring stories from people such as yourself and realize that there is an option outside of silently suffering, which you experienced, and now you're in a very different place, and still a member of your family, because you are still in, but you are mentally out. So hopefully these stories will give people some hope as well. Because
ultimately we want change, right? The end of captive policies, perhaps even some regulation on religious groups that entrap people.
Mm-hmm.
It would benefit a lot of people. It would reunite families. It would benefit Jehovah's Witnesses. It would benefit those who choose to leave. And we need to give some attention to that, because in that individuals have a faith that Jehovah's Witnesses that they would like to maintain as their way of finding hope and spirituality in the world. That can be present in the absence of coercive policies, and also those that cause extremely negative outcomes for those who are disillusioned. So really, if we can end those captive policies, then a lot of the fabric of this coercion would end.
Yeah. And that goes along with a lot of the content on this show that we hope for change, all the stuff around the troubled teen industry that we've spoken about. We hope for legal change with policies around these horrible programs that are still legally allowed to operate, and we definitely hope for change around things like disfellowshipping, because we've had a number of people come and speak about how devastating it is for them to be in a position of being disfellowshipped and to be mourning the loss of their family, basically, and to be grieving the loss of everybody all in one go, which nobody should ever have to experience. So you're absolutely right there. And in case anybody could tell, I'm not sure, Geoffrey, if you could tell, I was really nervous about this episode, because I definitely felt like I was going to be a bit intimidated by your knowledge of everything, and how well the book is written. And I was thinking, what if I babble and stutter loads, which I have done, and I've been really, really hot this entire episode. So hopefully my listeners will cut me some slack for this episode.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure. It really has. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, if anyone goes and reads the quality of your work, they'll realize where I'm coming from in terms of like feeling like not a very smart person in the room.
Oh, come on.
So definitely go and check out Geoffrey's work. I'll post all the information in the episode description for anybody that wants to go and check out some more of that. And all that there is left to do is for me to say a massive thank you for your time today. I cannot wait to share this episode with everybody.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate just having the opportunity, just to get the word out, and, I appreciate
That's
it.
Great.
Thank you for
so
the platform.
Much.
I really do appreciate it.
It's absolutely my privilege, and I will speak to you soon, Geoffrey. Enjoy the rest of your day.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can do so by emailing me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.